All right, what do you guys got for me?
Hey, morning, Max. How are you?
Hey, Shaw, doing good.
Good, thanks. Max, quick question about the assignment.
Hmm.
So typically, uh, in this case, I would go back to business and clarify a few things. I have a few questions. So is that, I mean, that's something you would do? Because I mean, you look at the information that you have and create a data model or ERA, whatever you call it. Try to understand the business need or clients' problems. And then obviously, if you have questions before finalizing anything, you get back to them to clarify those.
Absolutely, yeah. So in this case, you can pretend that I'm the business, and whatever questions you have, I'm happy to answer.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thanks.
You do not need to control C out of the terminal Phobelia after installing Brew. The only time we need to control C is when we are running a server. So most terminal commands, they'll run for however long they take. Some are a couple seconds, some are a minute or two to install it. And then when they're done installing, they finish running the command. Servers are a little different in the terminal because obviously we want to keep the server running so we can use it and access it down the road. So yeah, all we need to do is hit Control C whenever we've got a command that we want to stop running. And the biggest example of that would be a server.
Can I piggyback off of Shaw's question,
Yep.
please, Max? This is Latonia. So one of the follow-up questions I had was, it talks about wanting to basically use the data down the road.
Yep.
For like reports and things. And so what I had added into my little mock, well, my notes at this point, is to have like a miscellaneous notes section. I'm just kind of wondering, is that something that you would do for a table, or should I be looking at something else for that part of it?
Miscellaneous notes as in something that you would want to store in the order, or miscellaneous notes as, oh, that's a feature that I would want to add down the road?
No, as in like the repair order. Yeah, like I don't know if something quirky happened with the order or what have you. I just didn't know if there was like a more appropriate way to address that kind of thing for them to be able to access and then use that data down the road.
Yeah, so great question. Adding a notes field is very common, right? Because adding notes to something is something we do as humans all the time, right? In fact, it happened this week. Laura was setting up the feedback form for the mock interviewers to provide feedback, and there wasn't a notes field. And I'm like, well, if I do a mock interview, I'm going to fill out all the grading stuff. And she had a bunch of great questions lined up. But I'm like, but I also want to be able to like just throw notes in there. And Google Forms is essentially a database, right? It is still storing all of the results of those forms, whether it goes into a spreadsheet or wherever else it goes. At the end of the day, that's sitting in a database somewhere. And so, I had to say to Laura, hey, can you add a notes field so that as an interviewer, I've got a place to stick those notes? That exact thing could happen at the service order. You could build out this whole app, and if there's not a notes field and the technicians use notes a lot, all of a sudden we run into this problem of there's no place for the technician to shove those notes. And so they start keeping notes manually and writing down numbers, and then that becomes a huge headache. So yes, there are definitely times we want to add a notes field to our ERD or to a column in the database. With that said, you also have to be careful because all of a sudden the technicians will start putting everything in notes, and they start using things that are not in a standard format, or they go, oh, I would really like this other field to be added, but because it's not there, I'm going to shove it into the notes. And then it becomes really hard to analyze that data and figure out, whatever things they're leaving in those notes, it becomes hard to use. So I think notes is in general a good idea, because it makes sense to really have a place to store information relevant to that table or the order or whatever it is. But at the same time, you also want to tell the business, hey, if there are more fields that pop up down the road that you would like to include in your reports outside of just, shoving something in the notes, let us know, because we want to structure that data properly so we can analyze it later. Great question.
Thank you. That was helpful. I guess I was thinking like the part where you just said like analyzing it later. That's why I was asking like should it be miscellaneous notes, or should I be looking at some other way for them to better be able to analyze that down the road? But that makes sense, just to check in, like Shah was saying, just check in, see what they need, make changes, what have you. Okay, thank you.
And in this case, if any of those questions pop up, throw them in the students channel in Slack. Instead of direct messaging me, only because I think everyone would benefit from hearing the answers to those questions. But yeah, it's one of those things where we can't analyze data unless you tell us what data you would like analyzed. And so that's a common thing, to ship this out there, and then the business owner come back to you and go, oh, I forgot to tell you, I want this field added, and sometimes that's a pain, right? Because sometimes whatever they're adding now makes a one-to-one relationship of many to many. And so you're like, oh, I've got to move data around. I've got to move it into a different table now. I've got to come up with different fields. I've got to figure out how that old data is going to make it into the new data format. That can be a headache. But much better to get those requirements now and ask those questions now, as opposed to shipping the entire app and then going, oh, I forgot, this is another thing that we track.
And I know from my husband's experience, save every iteration, because a lot of times the user really doesn't know what they want sometimes, or they don't know how to express it. And they're speaking English, and we're speaking code. And, and they'll come back and it'll be the first version that was 500 versions ago is really how they want it in the first place.
And that's when you should be using a tool like Git, because Git is saving all of your revisions.
Yeah. And you just, they don't always know what they want. They don't always know how to express it. And that's true in library land too. The users, I mean, they're not there to know it all. They're they need you to kind of walk them through it and stuff too. So, yeah.
And yes, Carolyn, the way to tell is the terminal should be telling you what file path you're in and expecting another command. And if it's not doing that, Control-C should almost always get you back to that so you can do that. Dominique, I saw a hand raised.
Yeah, I was gonna put it in the I was gonna ask you which Slack channel you want us to put these questions in, because I actually have with you being the business owner, I actually do have questions for you.
Sure.
You say you have small appliances. What type of small appliances?
Doesn't really matter for the sake of the case, but we'll just say it's, they're bringing in toaster ovens or vacuum cleaners or stuff like that.
Okay. And then question number 2, how many techs do you have? Technicians?
Let's say 5.
5? Okay. And I'll more than likely have more questions for you later on when I'm making my tables, but thank you for that. Thank you.
Yep. Feel free to dump them in. There are at least probably 2 or 3 questions that you would need for your tables that probably aren't covered in the business case. And then there are some other things that you won't need for the database tables, but when we start getting into the wireframing of it, you're going to be like, oh, well, if I'm making this for, 1,000 technicians, I may design the app a little differently than if I'm designing this for a small mom and pop shop who has 5 technicians. And so there may be more questions that come up later in the process. And so we will identify those and definitely say, all right, pause, I'm taking off my developer hat or my instructor hat here and pretending to be the business owner and giving you answers to that. And I think Carolyn already hit one of them of, oh, well, these are on the same line. Does that mean they should be the same column in the table? And it's just like, well, as a business owner, I can't tell you the answer to that, but as a database designer, I can. So, you have to play that role sometimes of, all right, let me figure out what it should be, not just what I'm being told it should be. Carolyn, I have to look. I do not think we track payroll in this app.
because, you know, there's the estimated time it will take, how long it took, and, you know, and I didn't know if the business owner needed something that would also help them connect, or if there's like a separate database and somehow the two databases will talk with a bridge.
In this example, I would say that we would just export out the time information as a report, and then the business owner could then use that information to overlay it with whatever payroll they're using. There is a term called scope creep, which is, you know, oh, well, while we have all of this data in here, wouldn't it be great if we could also do payroll in this app?
Wash
at
the
which
windows
point, at which point you have to go back and you have to say, yeah, we can add payroll, but this is a custom application, right? So it's going to take us $10,000 to add in payroll to this application because we're building it from scratch. Now, $10,000, obviously a big chunk of money, especially for a small company, when they could go to Gusto or ADP or any other payroll provider, or some time tracking software, and get a lot more out of it. Payroll is one of those things where you go, oh, well, I'm just tracking hours. How hard can it be? But there's that little thing called taxes that make everything more complicated in payroll. And so payroll is not something I've done time tracking in apps before. I've built a scheduling app from scratch. I actually just got an email this week that SU is going to stop using it. Like years and years after I created it. It was my first custom application that I made. Anytime I open the code, I have to choke down some vomit in my throat. But it is, you know, whenever you write code, you come back to it years later and you've just learned so much and grown so much.
It's not yours anymore. Sometimes other people add to it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, payroll, I would say, is a good example of scope creep, and something we could say, yeah, we can do that. That's an additional feature. It would cost X amount. And here are some other alternatives, right? Because a lot of times a business owner knows what they want, but they don't know how to shop for what they want. And so part of being a custom developer is telling them, hey, heads up, it may actually be a lot cheaper for you to use something that we call off-the-shelf software, right? Of this, hey, this is already built for this purpose. Yep. We can make it so whatever we are building interfaces well with that other application. Here are a couple other applications that we can recommend and we can shop around for you. But we are hourly, and building things from scratch custom always is going to cost more than grabbing something off the shelf.
Yeah, and that builds the trustworthiness. I mean, you're not just trying to take their money, you know.
Yeah.
But the other thing with payroll, you've got benefits. You know, is there overtime? Is there holiday pay? You know, I mean, it is a whole puppy unto itself. So I'm glad this isn't going to be part of the.
No, and there are all kinds of, the thing that you don't really realize about payroll and taxes until you're a business owner is, unless you're paying them as a contractor, if you're paying them as a W-2 full-time employee or regular employee, every state that you have employees in is a different state you need to register and pay taxes in. And a lot of those registration processes are done by mail, where they mail you a code that you've got to type into your payroll system. And your payroll provider goes, this is a legal business incorporation thing, and getting your tax ID number set up in all of those states. So tell us that information and we will use it, but you have to go through all of that setup, which has been a real problem with remote working, because we've got employees in 10 different states. And so we now have to go incorporate our business as a foreign entity in all 10 of those states and deal with 10 state separate payrolls. So when you grow, if you ever get to the point where you have so much contract work you would like to hire another contractor to work with you, it makes a lot more sense to pay them as a 1099 contractor as opposed to a W-2, just so you don't have to worry about taxes. There are a lot of legal distinctions between a W-2 and a 1099 and what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do with them. And the only reason why I'm rambling on about this is because that's a common thing you guys may run into of, oh, I've got someone who would like to do a project for me. We agreed on, $1,000 price. now when they pay me, how do I do those taxes, and worrying about self-employment. And at a certain point, you go, oh, I'm doing this enough where I need to incorporate either as a LLC, a limited liability corporation, or as a DBA, a doing business as, where you get to use a different business name. So that is a whole new world that transitions from my developer experience over to more entrepreneurial experience. But that's a whole world you can get into. Yeah, and 1099s across state lines don't really matter. It doesn't matter where the person lives, as long as they're in the US. You can just pay them and send them a 1099 and say, hey, I paid you this much, and now you have to go report taxes on it. But as a W-2, that is a whole monster. Other questions you guys have?
Is it okay to have more than 9 tables?
Yes.
Thank you.
Realize I did not post in Slack a reminder of this.
Do you have advice on how to approach this? Because I'm sort of overwhelmed.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's a very common thing. This business case is a page and a half long, but you want to break it down into steps, which we're doing, right? Of, all right, let's separate out. Let's not think about how this is going to show up in a front end. Let's not think about the back end. Let's not think about where the buttons are going to go or anything like that. Let's only focus on the database. From there, obviously, there's still a lot to break down, because you're like, I don't even know where to start. General rule of thumb, I would say 90% of application databases, if not more, all have a users table. So if you're like, I'm looking at a blank canvas, I understand all the concepts of an ERD, where do I dive in? The users table it can often be a good place to start, because you're like, I'm going to need user ID in other places. Let's just get the table going. Now let me think about where I need to store user ID. And that will often lead you to the next table. And from there, you start realizing, oh, I've got to draw lines. I've got to make more tables. And you start picking up speed. Another technique you can use, and I'm really glad you asked this question, is what table is probably going to have the longest list of rows? What is like the thing I identify of like the whole business revolves around this? And there are probably 2-ish answers, but only one of those answers has a list of 10 plus rows. And so once you start getting that table going, what you're going to find is you're going to want to put things in that table and then realize that there's a one-to-many relationship on them, and start spinning your other tables out of that. Because there's a many-to-many relationship, or a one-to-many, doesn't really matter. And so that should help of like, what does this business revolve around? And from there, I can start identifying the long list of things in the business case, and then start getting tables outside of that.
Okay.
Either approach is good, and you can combine them. You can go, all right, let me do my users table first, and then let me figure out what does that user do in the software. Oh, that means they're going to be interacting with this giant table. And then you go on to the second approach, which is, let me figure out the long list of all the fields that I think I need to track, and make sure they all make sense to go in one table. And if they don't, do separate tables on that. Other questions? We won't be imposing formats. Imposing formats tends to be something we do in the back end. Better to do that in JavaScript when we have the power of regex. Some databases don't support regex natively. Postgres does, but anyway, Data formatting is something that we tend to do on the back end before we store it in the database. We want to store it in the correct format, as opposed to storing it in whatever format the user gives us and then formatting it before we send it back to them. As for character limits, yeah, it's probably a good thing to think about during our ERD, because the point of the ERD in a traditional organization is the database engineer or the database administrator hands you this as a developer and says, these are the columns you're getting, make it work with these. And there are times that you have to go back and say, well, I would like to store more information, or this isn't the right data type, or, this is going to cause problems, or whatever it is. But for the most part, when you're handed an ERD, you don't get to negotiate with that. You don't get to say like, well, I would like to just add another column for the sake of adding another column. The database engineer is going to do all of that work for you. And so that's why it's good to have those column limits on it. So as a developer, you can be like, wait, phone number is only 10 digits long. That must mean that we aren't going to store the dashes in the database. So I'm going to store just the number as opposed to 3 digits, dash 3 digits, dash 4 digits. So yes, character limits on the rows, definitely something that you wanna think about now. Varchars tend to be 255 characters at a maximum, but things like first name, last name, probably not going to hit 255 characters. For things like notes, well, 2 or 3 sentences, you hit 255 characters. So maybe notes should be a text field. Okay, when we're talking about all of these IDs, or we're talking about a timestamp, we want to get the database thinking about that as well and storing that in the most efficient manner. So character limits factors into data types, right? Timestamp, you don't really need to set a data length on it because the database manages that for us. For things like ID, we want to give it a heads up that it's an integer, but we don't need to define how long that integer is. For things like text, it could be any length of text for notes, but for varchars, we would have a character limit. Other questions? How are we feeling about this week overall? Are we feeling like we learned a lot? We feeling, the pacing was a little different. I know we used a lot more video resources this week, but I don't know, I got to the end of this week and compared it to cohort 1, and I was like, my God, we did a much better job on databases this time around. That's a good question. Microsoft Access I think it's still around, a tool that was very popular in the 90s and the early 2000s when databases started taking off. A lot of companies said, well, databases are so awesome. We're in love with them. We should allow consumers to use databases as well. PageMaker was the big name at the time. Access was Microsoft's version of it. Trying to think of others that aren't coming to the top of my head, but this notion of like users will often need spreadsheets, but they may need more than that. They may need a database. We should create something that allows consumers to use a database. And the blowback from that was pretty big, and they found out pretty quickly that letting users work with databases who didn't understand SQL, pretty bad idea. And what they tried to do is they tried to do this whole like, you don't need a custom application, all you need is a database. So we will create a tool that you can interact with a database without learning SQL, and now all of a sudden your need for a custom application goes away. and the people Microsoft were selling access to were people like a small appliance mom and pop repair shop, right? Where they could go, you don't want to hire a developer to make this application for you. If you learn just the fundamentals of a database, you can make a database yourself. I'm pretty sure Access runs on top of MS SQL. And it's kind of doing what SQLize was doing for us, which is generating out SQL queries and running them under the hood. But for the most part, and to your point, Kyle, what Microsoft learned was Excel is where we draw the line. And a lot of end users understand how to work with Excel. And maybe you have advanced Excel users who can use features like a pivot table to do data analysis, or people who understand more than just the sum in Excel, right? Excel has a lot of great count if formulas, and Excel, as of the release 2 or 3 years ago, actually now supports JavaScript. So you can write JavaScript functions as a formula into Excel, and Excel will use that, which opens Excel up to actually being able to make API calls and pull in third-party data and dump it back into Excel. So really cool stuff. Google Sheets also supports custom formulas. There was one that I needed. We were creating our data element dictionary, or a DED, which is basically saying what's the list of values that could possibly show up in our database. What are the things we expect the user to say, or the user to interact with? And at the time, we were camel casing all of those names. Well, Google Sheets and Excel don't have a native camel caser. They have to upper and to lower and all of that stuff, but they don't have a camel case. And so I wrote a custom function in 15 lines of JavaScript that just camel cased the text for me. And now we have an equals and then camel, and you put in whatever you want to camel case in Excel, runs the JavaScript code to camel case that using string, and then returns it back into the Excel or Google Sheets cell that we use it in. So really cool stuff that you can do in Sheets, but you also have to know spreadsheets do not support one-to-many relations, right? When you want to put a couple values in one cell, you can comma separate it, but there is a limit. And so that becomes a more natural thing to find of, oh, this should be relational data, and we can't store relational data in an Excel list. Yes, and Word actually for a time supported mail merge with Access. So you could point mail merge at an Access database and pull in your users table and mail merge things in there. But Access was just a dumpster fire when people came to use it, because it's like, it was a tool that you needed training on, and no other Office application do you need training on, right? If you open up Word, you're not going to know every feature right out of the box, but you can open up Word, understand the concepts of file saving, and go create a document and start learning by exploring. Oh, I want this to be bold. That looks like a bold button. Let me go click on it. Excel is getting closer to that borderline, but not over it yet, right? Of like, all right, someone probably needs to tell me about this equals thing and using formulas, but like, I understand a table, and I understand clicking here, typing in data, and adjusting my columns and all of that. Access is right. It was like a hair over the line of not needing training. And Microsoft tried to sell it as, you don't need training on this. You can just pick up the software and go. And the principles of database design, like not duplicating data or understanding data relations and all of that stuff, was just over that not needing any training line, and why it blew up spectacularly.
Yeah, you didn't need training to use the software. It's like a lot of other things people learn. Oh, I can use Dreamweaver. And they don't get like web design. You know. But yeah, exactly. I ran into some databases like that people had designed. It was like, oh my God. So, but yeah, and that's a long time ago. But the concepts haven't changed. The software has quite a bit. Right?
Yeah, and even the SQL hasn't changed significantly. There are newer versions of SQL, but for the most part, what they came out with in the 70s was actually pretty surprisingly robust. And so SQL hasn't changed much. The scaling databases has changed a lot of how do we run multiple database servers and manage data replication and all of that kind of stuff. That has changed. The players in the game have not changed a lot. Microsoft and Oracle still huge players, became huge players in the 80s and have been around since. I would say open source databases have gotten a lot more popular because they do scale pretty well. It used to be that you could use a free database, but as soon as you started getting like 10,000 or more users interacting with that database, you had to go to Oracle or Microsoft and pay someone to use their better database. That has definitely changed. Google uses Postgres and MySQL. There are other huge companies that are using these free open source databases. So the cost of the tools has definitely come down for developers, and has even brought the cost down for Microsoft and Oracle, not being able to charge an arm and a leg for that anymore because there are open source alternatives. But it's also very possible that you go to a company and they go, we use Oracle. Oracle manages a lot of the things for us, and we don't have to worry about it. And for the most part, because there are only minor SQL variations between all the databases, in theory, unless you are the database engineer, there's not much you need to worry about there between the differences between them. With a caveat of if you're using NoSQL or something like Mongo, obviously that is a different way of thinking about it. But at the end of the day, the concepts still apply of, how am I storing data? Where am I storing the data? What tables are they going in, or collections? What's the format of either the rows and the columns or the document, whatever it is. The end of the day, a database is a database, no matter whether you're using SQL to access the data or not. I feel like this assignment is so daunting. I've sucked all questions out of you guys for office hours. You're all like, I just want to do that assignment and get it done and over with.
I actually haven't looked very closely at it again. I skimmed through it and I haven't started like doing, because I have to go through the last 2 classes and fill in some gaps and do some setup. I
I
may
would
have
say-
more over the weekend for you.
That's fine. And feel free to throw them in Slack, and I'm happy to answer them. And like I said, the questions that you come up with will probably be beneficial answers for the other students.
Right.
The other thing I can use, Susan, to loop back to your where do I even start question is like, take a notebook out and just start writing things down, right? Because the way it is organized in the business case is purposely not around where you would start as a developer, right? Because in the real world, you're not going to get developer requirements, or you're not going to get requirements in the order that you want them to be in. And the approach that I would take for this is going to be different than someone else's approach, right? Of like, I just need to get this data in a format that I can start going through and crossing things off. And so whatever is jumping out to you, it may make sense, like just jot that down on a scratch pad, and then whatever format that scratch pad comes out in may be more helpful to start building the tables around. I don't know if that makes sense, but just this notion of like, let me think about this in a way that it makes sense for me to think about it. And now that I have done that, I can design a database around it. But a paragraph with 15 sentences in it is not going to be, it's not like you can go through sentence by sentence and just add that to the database. So just starting to organize things before you even get into the diagramming tool may be helpful. Yeah, and Kyle, great point. Using a whiteboard for this makes total sense, right? I upgraded a spiral bound notebook. I was using legal pads for 4 years and made the switch over to a notebook. As a junior developer, I exclusively used a whiteboard. Now these days, it's more just things getting thrown at me where I just need to jot down single lines. But whenever I'm doing a diagram, whenever I'm doing documentation, there is always a let me brain dump this before I actually start on the deliverable or the code for it. And just planning out code is so important, because otherwise you'll get something done and then be like, what do I do next? And then you realize what you do have to do next impacts the code you've already written. And if you had known about both those steps, you would have written the code differently the first time. And so just having your steps written out, or being able to pull apart a large requirement and break it down into action items is important.
But also to try and put yourself in the user's shoes, business owner. Not, and like separate yourself from developer and just person that walks in. It's like, what am I asking for? What do I want?
For user design, I would
And then
say,
translate that into the how you set it up.
yeah, I would be careful about doing that in the database design step. You definitely want to take that mindset in your user interface design of like, what do I need to see? What would it make sense for me to click on as an end user? And that's how I need to design it. But for a database, for most people, it's not going to make sense to keep parts separate from your service orders. Well, no, if I think about when I'm working right now without a computer, I just write down whatever parts I used on my service order. So my service order should have all my parts information, right? And it's like, well, no, not quite. Your parts are a separate table, and you're just keeping track of what parts you used on that service order. So yes, you're tracking your parts on the service order, but the parts are in a separate table.
Yeah.
And if you tried to tell that to an end user, they'd be like, why? Right? Like, no, it's all in the service order, right? And if you read the whole business case, you can be like, all of this is just one giant service order. I don't understand why you need to design things around it. So that's why I would say just try not to think too much as an end user. You can think of an end user of what data do I need to track. That is a way to think for this assignment. But I would caution thinking too much like a user in your database design, and save that more for the wireframing phase of, all right, now what information do I need to shove in here?
See, that's hard because it was really drilled into us as library, the user. So it's like, I can't, but I'm the user in this case. It's like, but yeah. Okay. I will follow that. Thank you.
For anything, we use two terms a lot, UI and UX. UI is user interface, and then UX is the user experience. UX is the broader term that encompasses UI, right? So we think about user interface as what screens show up and how do they interact with them. But it's not just about screens anymore. There's the user experience of what happens if they use a smart speaker to use our app and are talking to Alexa or whatever. What happens when we're on a phone and they are tapping through things? Well, that's going to impact your user interface, but overall, it's the user experience that we're talking about. And so we just hired a user experience full-time employee, and their job is to build out the UI, but largely think about the user experience as a whole of what steps are they completing in our software? What do they have to use outside of our software, which also goes outside of the UI? What other tools are they using for project management? Where are they pulling this data in from? How often are they switching between tabs? All of that stuff is user experience. But we don't think about that until we get to the UI phase. We don't do that at the ERD step. So I don't personally use PG bind because I largely use Sequelize. If you take a look at, if you go to NPM and just do a search for PG bind, you'll find that it only has 33 weekly downloads. So anything under 1,000, I'm very cautious of, and anything under 10,000, I'm still cautious about. When you get into a package that has like 100,000 weekly downloads, you know it's used enough that it's reliable and stable for you. If you do a search for Sequelize, Sequelize has 100,000. I'm sorry, 1 million weekly downloads. And then if you go to something like Express, Express has 16 million weekly downloads. So when you're comparing that to 30 weekly downloads, that's when I start to go, I wonder if there's either a more popular package that does this for me, or if this is something that I should write custom code for. So I know we talked a little bit about binding and using the $123 to prevent SQL injection. I've always relied on Sequelize for that, and Sequelize has just built that in for me. One of the reasons I was so hesitant to teach this module is that I don't write raw SQL anymore. I haven't written raw SQL for my job in years, right? When you've got a data set of 9 million rows, all of a sudden, yeah, I need to be thinking about my SQL and how to write it. But when you're talking about 100,000 rows, Sequelize can interact and do all of that for you. And so day in and day out, I've got the concepts of database design in the back of my head when I create new tables and columns and set up relations. But the way I interact with all of that is through Sequelize. And I do that all in my models. And then whenever I do a query, instead of writing a select query, I'm writing a .find in Sequelize and allowing that to pull it out. So one of the reasons that I use so many resources from Khan Academy was because professionally, I haven't used SQL in a while. And so it would be, even though I use it technically every day through Sequelize, off the top of my head, I'm like, all right, I got to teach you like select queries and insert queries. What else do I have to cover? How do I cover that syntax? All of that stuff, which is why it made more sense to me to pull in a resource like Khan Academy, who made sure they had a pretty thorough curriculum to cover the basics of SQL. So I don't use PG bind. Binding is important. It's a very important concept to make sure that you don't have injection happening. But at the same time, if you are using a well-trusted library like Sequelize that does the binding for you under the hood, and you can look at their documentation and confirm that they're doing the binding for you, it's not something that you need to worry about. Only if you're writing the raw SQL and interacting with the database is a bind more concerning. But as a back-end developer, you'll find there are very few cases that you're interacting with SQL directly as opposed to interacting with an ORM or an ODM if you're using Mongo, relational versus document.
Thanks, Max. But my question was also about the playground. So when you go to click on the link and says this is a playground where you can test your code. And yeah, they have over 1 million node packages pre-installed. So this is something where you can run your code even if you don't have access to your dev environment like Node and other stuff. I mean, I tested with the small functions at work, but just wanted to see what you think. Have you used it? Do they recommend using this?
Gotcha. I have not used RunKit. I've heard of it. I've never actually used it. Mainly because it's super easy for me to NPM install a package and just play around with it, require it in, see if it's working for me. And if it isn't, I just uninstall it and find a different one. RunKit is definitely something you could try. I'm not opposed to it. And the other thing is Code Sandbox and CodePen can both be configured to run NPM packages. So if you wanted to test more in a project environment, you could either use CodePen or Code Sandbox. But if you were exclusively like, I just want to play around with this package and see if this package can do what I want, RunKit would probably be a pretty good option for you. Sorry, you got 2 rants out of that for the price of 1 question.
Max, can I ask a question that's not
Sure.
related to the topic and this week?
Sure.
So I didn't know that the browser was an object itself, and then you have documents.style.other stuff. And I can, there you have windows.open or windows.close opens a new tab. So is this really, when you click on open a new tab, is this what the system is doing behind the scene, or activating or calling that function?
Yes, but kind of the other way around. So when you click on the plus button in Chrome to open a new tab, it is using the Chrome SDK, software development kit, which are all of the functions that are built into Chrome itself. So Chrome, I'm not actually sure what language it's written in, but Chrome actually has a software development kit that you can use to like build extensions or interact with the Chrome browser directly. So when you click the new tab button in the interface, it is using code native to Chrome in order to open the tab and actually know like, oh, I need to keep track of how many tabs are open, what the titles of the tab are, all of that stuff. With that said, there is always a bridge that JavaScript uses to connect into the browser. That bridge would be used for something like window.open. And so there's a list of JavaScript requirements the browser needs to know how to handle, like alert or window.open or target blank or the title in the HTML, or I'm trying to think of other things, but there are native JavaScript functions, document.scroll, things like that, that every browser that uses JavaScript most likely has to support. And so they are understanding what that code is in your JavaScript and then bridging that or mapping that into their internal functions to actually pull that off and make the scroll happen and all of that. So it's not that the browser is relying on JavaScript to like make the tab show up or make a new tab open, but those two are connected. So when you use a window.open, the window.open is detected by the browser, and then the browser has to go execute that action for you. Yeah, out of that list, Carolyn, it's probably most likely the majority of it is written in C++. Java is probably only for the Android app, which they said. Parts of it may be written in JavaScript, but I think what they largely mean is that it can execute JavaScript and understand JavaScript and has that bridge set up. But building a web browser from scratch is like building an operating system from scratch, and something that Microsoft just gave up on. For years, they had Internet Explorer, obviously, and then they started working on Edge, and they invested, I'm sure, millions of dollars into building up Edge, and they went, screw this, this is too hard, we're the most hated browser in the industry, we'll just use Chromium. And Chromium is the web browser that, is the rendering engine behind Chrome itself. And so that's all open source. Google's like, anyone can use that. And so Firefox, Safari, and Chrome have their own rendering engines. Chromium, Blink, and WebKit. One's for JavaScript, one's for rendering HTML. and SpiderMonkey, I think, is what Firefox uses. Top of my head, maybe mixing up the rendering engines and their name of their JavaScript engines of basically what's running the JavaScript code. Because Chrome also uses V8 for their JavaScript code. Anyway, all under the hood stuff of basically when I give a browser my HTML and my JavaScript, how does it pull it off? And that is the rendering engine or the JavaScript engine. And Internet Explorer has bowed out of that, or Microsoft has bowed out of that and said, we'll just use Chrome's. So now if you're using a modern version of Edge, you are using the same internal guts that Chrome uses to get web pages to show up. And the rendering engine handles both HTML and CSS. The JavaScript engine is separate from that. But obviously interlinked because our JavaScript can impact our HTML.
Question.
Yeah.
I need a little deeper clarification. Rendering versus display.
Rendering is the process to make the display happen.
Okay.
So not synonyms, but close enough that they could be considered one.
Yeah.
Right. Rendering, typically when you say rendering, there is some process involved. It takes CPU power, it takes RAM, rendering, as opposed to display, which is just like dump it on the screen. So you can say my HTML is displaying, but before it can display the HTML, it's got to render the HTML, figure out what the style sheets are, figure out the placement of all the divs. That whole process is called rendering. And it's something that React uses heavily, right? When we return something we're returning it in a function-based component, but it is still rendering and in a class-based component instead of just saying function and then our component name. When we said class component name extends component, and then we had our render function inside of that, and then a return in there, they're both rendering. The functional component is using a little bit more shorthand to pull that off. But rendering is a process that React has kind of taken over from the browser and given the developer more control over the render itself, instead of just dumping HTML to the browser, issuing JavaScript commands to the browser and making the browser render it. Under the hood, React acts as a middleman and controls the rendering more behind the scenes instead of dumping it all on the browser. And that entire concept in React is called the virtual DOM. And basically that at the end of the day, the browser's got to have the document object model. It's got to be able to control it. But browser has this interstitial layer where it can execute JavaScript and re-render things much faster because it has more control over what it is rendering.
So going back a few years, rendering and display were kind of the same thing way back. Because people used to say, my screen's not rendering, and it's like, but there's more going on there. Was there always more, or has that changed?
Yes. It used to be like before we were talking about web pages, right? We were talking about I've got buttons and my buttons have pixels and those pixels need to show up on the screen. And so in I don't want to say in older programming languages, but in non-HTML based languages, what you would do is you would build out your whole layout and specify, all right, this is going to start at this XY coordinate, and it's going to be so many pixels wide and so many pixels tall. And you would create all of those components, and then you would tell the page render. And so all the components would show up at once instead of a component popping in as all the components were showing up. HTML has a different approach to that, where, it was built for the web, and it was built to kind of show all the information at once. But once we started using web apps more frequently, like Facebook or Gmail, or when they became more interactive, when there were more screens, when the user was clicking on buttons, and that's when render and display probably started to split out a little bit in the HTML land. And so React saw the opportunity to be able to do that faster if you built in their framework. And that is one of the benefits of using React instead of just vanilla JavaScript. Instead of, React controlling the render and understanding the state and understanding that only a piece of the page has been updated, as opposed to issuing vanilla JavaScript commands and leaving it up to the browser to figure out what they need to re-render. But all of that is, you do not need to understand any of that if you would like to be a good developer. You just, if you wanted to get into the guts, or like, oh, I want to make my React application run faster, or I noticed this particular component is taking a long time to load, or that's when you can get into what they call the component lifecycle in React, which is basically what happens before this component mounts, what happens before this component unmounts, which mounting is the process of rendering. I'm being careful there. It is also the process of the component displaying as well. And so there's a component will mount, a component did mount, pre and post it actually displaying. There's unmount, there's all kinds of stuff. Component will receive props, which is more of a class-based thing. All different kinds of ways you can hook into the component lifecycle. And use effect has definitely complicated that with functional components. Yeah, sorry, you opened Pandora's box on that one.
I mean, I didn't speak for anyone else, but I love this, this stuff, you're passionate about it, you fill in, some of the stuff we've covered, but it's a good review, but I'm a big picture person. And if I get the big picture, I understand the details better. So yep. I appreciate it. So I'm sorry if I opened up a Pandora's box, but thank you very much.
All good. Yeah, there are times that my rants will hit a point where I'm like, I need to shut up now because I'm not an expert in this field. Yeah, I'm borderline considered an expert in full stack development, but that doesn't mean I'm an expert with React or browsers or anything like that. I know enough to use it. I don't know enough to explain how it works under the hood, which is, I think a concept that we need to learn to accept more as developers, because it's a concept that in society we have accepted more, right? We all drive cars. None of us know how to fix a transmission on a car, or maybe that's a sweeping statement, but it's like we have a level of, I understand that the car needs oil. I understand what an oil change is. I understand, tires and the concept of changing them. But at the same time, I don't know enough about my car to say, the transmission or how a carburetor is working, or, how to replace all of that. And that's kind of just a requirement of society moving forward, right? Is that we are able to use previous concepts and allow people to specialize, but benefit from that specialization. So, and you guys are all specializing now. You're just having to specialize in code so that people who use your code and use your user interfaces don't need to be experts and know how to write that code themselves. All right, I've done enough ranting today. Anyone have any final questions before I hop off? All right, well, you guys have a good day.